What images does France conjure up for you? For me, it's beautiful houses and gardens, but also glorious markets, street cafes, and a deeply formative experience. When I was 19, I came to the south of France and lived in Aix-en-Provence for 6 months. And ever since then, I've loved France and everything to do with it. And I want to share that passion for the country with you through its gardens. I'll discover what their gardens reveal about French history, their love of food, the soil, and the arts, and why they value order and structure so highly. I'll be travelling the byways of the French countryside. This is what a deux chevaux was made for. Meeting local gardeners.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Monty. Bonjour, José.
Tasting the very best of their harvest. Sometimes this job is really good. Getting to turn on huge fountains.
I can hear the water.
I'm trying to find out what makes French gardens, and indeed the French, unique. Today, I'm going to show you formal French gardens and reveal how they were built upon passion, and power, and ambition, and disgrace. In these gardens, you can see the story of France itself as the great figures of French history use their gardens to express their power. They thought nothing of remodeling landscapes, moving villages, even diverting rivers. And I'll see how this formal style and the rebellion against it still resonates today in the culture and gardens of modern France. This story begins here, by the banks of the river Cher in the Loire Valley, and at one of France's most famous chateaux. The year is 1555, and the place is Chenonceau in all its Renaissance glory. France is under the rule of Henri II. The gardens here are amongst the first and most important in France, and there were two built in sequence. The first, the large rectangular one, was created by the king's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. She was older than him, much older, 20 years older, but he adored her. And he gave her the chateau of Chenonceau as a statement of his love. And once here, she made herself a garden. And when she made it, it was a major work. It was large, took 4 years to build, and she put it practically in the river, so it needed these vast walls to protect it from the water. Of course, when it was done and people saw it, they didn't just admire the garden, they admired her as a statement of her power in the land. The garden was a lavish status symbol. Henri had to raise a special tax to pay for its construction, and it was built to be both decorative and productive. We know, for example, there was a delivery of 300 apple trees, and fruit would have been a key part of it, and of course the walls would have had fruit growing all the way around. And there were lots of flowers. There were irises and lilies and roses, so it would have been a very productive place, vegetables in there too, but it would have been lovely, it would have smelled lovely. There would have been flowers in every season. So it would have been this little paradise, enclosed and protected, but there to be enjoyed in every season and weather. I do think that this great terrace that goes right round the garden tells us so much about how the garden was used and viewed, because it wasn't for access. This was for Diane and her friends and ladies-in-waiting to come and walk round. And you could see them with their wonderful dresses, slowly promenaded round, the chateau in the background, and significantly the garden below them. So they viewed it from above and looking inwards. Diane's garden at Chenonceau is a superb example of an enclosed, protected Renaissance garden. But 5 years after she had completed it, the king died. His widow, Catherine de' Medici, kicked Diane out and proclaimed her power by building a garden of her own on the far side of the drawbridge. In many ways, it's strikingly similar to Diane's, with the same inward, enclosed structure. Catherine used it for secret meetings and political maneuvering, safe in its enclosed world. But within 100 years, the rich and powerful of France will be creating gardens on an even more extraordinary scale, outdoing each other with ever more ambitious plans. Landscapes would be reshaped, huge canals dug, and rivers rechanneled to supply elaborate water displays. These gardens would set a style which has remained a hallmark of the French garden ever since. One man new style of gardening, and now I want to show you the first of his gardens.
Visiting gardens is really difficult without a car. So I'm on my way to meet a man who's got a car for me, and it's not a good one.
I used to have a little 2CV years ago, and I'm looking forward to driving one again.
Jacques, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Ça va, voilà. Oui, ça va très bien. C'est belle. Oui. That's lovely. Il mange bien?
Très très bien, une merveille.
Oh! Bon.
Horloge.
OK.
Être prudent avec la boîte de vitesse, mais le moteur
Non, mais-
fonctionne très bien.
So, that lovely feeling. So let's put the key in the right way. It always helps. La première fois.
Ah oui, mais elle est comme neuve. Là, on est en première.
Bon,
Là, on est en deuxième.
ça y est.
Voilà.
C'est tout ça.
Merveilleux.
Merci beaucoup.
Bonne route.
Merci. A little bit tight. Oops. We're off.
The man who designed the garden I'm about to visit is the most important figure in French garden design. His name was André Lenotre. He was born 400 years ago and followed his father as royal gardener at the Tuileries in Paris. The first garden he was commissioned to make was at Vaux-le-Vicomte, 35 miles southeast of Paris.
André Lenotre spent 20 years as a royal gardener. He also been mixed with a group of sophisticated and creative people. So by the time he was called to Vaux-le-Vicomte, he was ready.
France in the mid-17th century was riven with rebellion and intrigue. The king, Louis XIV, had been on the throne since he was a boy, but had only just taken control of his kingdom. Lenotre and this brand new garden would be at the very center of a royal power struggle. This is the chateau of Vaux-le-Vicomte. And this is the garden that provoked a king to rage.
At first glance, everything seems completely ordered and absolutely symmetrical, but in fact, it's not symmetrical. As you look, there are differences on either side, but what it is harmonious and balanced. And that was the ideal that Lenotre was aiming for and achieved miraculously here.
Vaux-le-Vicomte belonged to and was commissioned by Nicolas Fouquet. He'd risen fast to become France's finance minister and had made himself colossally wealthy in the process. And he wanted to show the world that he had arrived. He asked Lenotre to do something more impressive and radical than had ever been done before. The result was a garden with a single great axis, which ran unbroken from the chateau's entrance to the far horizon.
Le Notre's big idea was to cut through the landscape on a scale that no one else had ever imagined before. And that created the impression of the garden reaching right out.
Le Notre broke the mold of Vaux by the scale and effortless ease in the way that the garden opens out to the visitor. Carefully judged changes in level meant that alleys, pools, cascades, and the canal that bisects the site gradually reveal themselves as you walk through. Mind you, Le Notre had Fouquet's limitless fortune and an army of 18,000 men to carve this out of the landscape.
But he also had another weapon in his armory, and that was military knowledge. By the middle of the 17th century, cannons had developed enormously, and in response to that, the French in particular developed the ability to create ramparts with very sophisticated earth-moving skills. And Le Notre took those skills and applied them to gardens.
Where once there were 190 acres of farmland, Le Notre and his army swept away a village and 2 hamlets and diverted a river to create Nicolas Fouquet's garden. But beneath the garden, there are also half a dozen water reservoirs, ingeniously engineered to feed the fountains, and it's all done by gravity.
Donc je vais vous ouvrir la trappe pour que vous puissiez descendre. Je vous montre.
The head gardener, Patrick Bourgeot, is showing me how it works.
Do you have to turn it on a hand?
Good.
Et on descend.
Yeah.
Descend.
Okay, we'll go down.
Allez-y, descendez, faites attention au dos.
Okay, here we go.
Attention à la dernière marche. Et donc voilà une des pompes du système hydraulique de vos vicomtes.
So it's the same pump, is it, that was being used throughout? Same system.
Le système est exactement le même qu'au XVIIe siècle, mais il a été entièrement reconstruit à la fin du XIXe siècle.
And how much water is in
En totalité, il y a 1500 mètres cubes.
Ça va?
Oui. Oui. Alors, juste... Wait. Let's go. Si vous voulez, on peut la tourner maintenant.
Near the water. And all those millions of gallons of water collected for the entertainment of a few people. Fantastic.
The protected intimacy of the Renaissance garden is thrown open and replaced by vast vistas. Instead of a safe haven, this garden is about scale and ambition. Presided over by a giant brooding Hercules, Vaux-le-Vicomte wasn't just a series of outdoor rooms where one might relax, entertain, or even scheme. This was a garden whose scale made it seem like a provocative political act.
This is a very masculine garden, and above all, it's a statement of power and wealth. And that fact was to prove to be its undoing.
On August the 17th, 1661, Nicolas Fouquet threw a party in the garden to celebrate the completion of the work. 6,000 people were invited, including the 22-year-old King Louis. The guests were bedazzled. There were wonderful fireworks and fountains, and even a specially commissioned play and a ballet.
It was a triumph, except for one thing. the king was beside himself with fury at the arrogance of Fouquet, showing that he was richer and potentially more powerful than himself. And just a few weeks later, he had Fouquet arrested and had him sent to prison, where he remained for the rest of his days. Now, Louis didn't stop there. Not only had he got rid of the man, he then proceeded to take everything that everyone had admired so much. He took statues. He even dug up plants. And above all, he took the designers, amongst whom was Le Nôtre. And he said to them, I want this. I want it just as good, if not better. And I want it bigger. And I want it at Versailles.
At that time, Versailles was still a modest hunting lodge. But within a year, Le Nôtre and his colleagues from Vaux-le-Vicomte were busy turning it into a palace and garden fit for a king. The Hall of Mirrors is the best introduction to the splendor of Versailles.
Wow.
Light is caught and magnified in over 350 mirrors. And by the time it was finished in 1680, the palace had grown to over 700 rooms. From its windows, you can gaze down at the enormity of the grounds, with nearly 2,000 acres of gardens stretching out to the far horizon.
The genius of Le Nôtre was to take what was already here and expand it and transform it. And there was already an avenue running east-west. So he widened it and put in this vast canal, and then with clipped hedges either side of it. So that the flat water, the clipped hedges were a perfect expression of domination over wildness. And that was a good thing. It wasn't considered to be suppression, but it was about order and harmony and peace. And to have those things, you had to have power. And to have them in a more dramatic way than anyone else in the world meant that Louis XIV, the Sun King, was the most powerful man in the world.
Just as he'd done at Vaux-le-Vicomte, Le Nôtre laid out a series of parterres, elaborate patterns in plants designed to be seen from above.
Originally, parterres got their colour from ground glass, broken pots, coloured gravel, but increasingly flowers. And as they poured in from all over the world, more and more were used. And tulips, for example, went from being incredibly precious to being more common. And in fact, there are stories of 150,000 plants coming in, plants being put in overnight, so Louis would wake up and see a new colour scheme, and nurseries made. There's one in the south of France, where exotics would come in and be trialled and grown on to see if they were hardy. And if they were good enough, they came up to Versailles.
While the tourists and I battle with our brollies in the wind and the rain, I'm on my way down to the orangerie to see the citrus trees being brought out of their winter quarters. Being Versailles, this was built as the biggest orangerie in Europe. There are over 1,100 trees here. Each one has to be brought out in spring and then put back into the orangerie in autumn to protect it from frost.
This style of container, of course, is known in England as a Versailles planter. And it is almost perfect for moving the citrus about. In Italy, of course, they're in terracotta pots always. But I bet some of them break. And these can be repaired endlessly because they have the metal corners and then the oak sides get replaced as needed. Although I've been told that there are records in the 18th century of them collapsing, and just as they're moved, the whole thing falls apart. And the secret are the metal corners.
Hop, je prends, hop, un citron. Et je mets ça dans les mains, comme ça, je fais ça.
Oh,
Et là, ça c'est bon.
yes.
Ça, c'est quand t'as le blues. Quand t'as le blues. Tu vois?
Oui.
Ça, c'est bon. Tu vois?
Ah,
Hein?
c'est
Ça
fantastique.
coûte pas cher et t'es heureux. Tu vois,
Joel Cotin is the head
c'est pas
gardener.
grand-chose, tu vois. Il y en a qui vont à l'autre bout de la terre. Moi, je vais pas à l'autre bout de la terre. Il y a tout ce qu'il faut ici.
We all know about Le Nôtre as a designer and a great historic figure, but as a gardener, what do you think he was like?
Alors, le terme designer pour le nôtre ne lui convient pas. Moi, le terme jardinier lui va très bien. Et surtout le terme, c'est un curieux de l'époque. Donc il s'est intéressé à tous les arts de l'époque. Et il a eu la chance de naître au Louvre. Son père était jardinier au Louvre. Donc c'est quelqu'un, un curieux qui s'est intéressé à tous les arts. Et donc, en plus, il a eu dans sa vie la chance de rencontrer un roi, et un roi qui lui a donné les moyens d'exprimer son talent.
Versailles took everything that had preceded it and exaggerated it. There's just more of Versailles than anywhere else, and it's still a byword for enormity in a garden. And what we see now is not so very different to the 17th century. It would have been full of people because the court had to be here. They had to be observed, and Louis kept his eye on them.
Le Nôtre employed several devices to create the sense of scale and surprise. Water was perhaps the most important, which he used in vast reflective pools of light and in a series of extraordinary fountains. Another was dramatic alley of tightly clipped trees.
There are few things in life finer than a good hedge. And the hedges here at Versailles are particularly good. And they're mostly hornbeams, and it lends itself to great big hedges because it will grow very tall, but at the same time can be clipped very narrow. And this one, for example, is pencil thin. So it creates room for another narrower passageway on the other side, which has a lot of dynamism and energy, and I find just completely thrilling.
On either side of the central axis, Le Nôtre laid out a series of bosquets, small woods contained by clipped hedges.
Voilà, donc je vais vous faire passer par le chemin des jardiniers,
Ouais.
qui va vous permettre d'accéder directement au bosquet.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Inside each of these bosquets is an entertainment or spectacle designed to be visited in turn as...
This was Le Nôtre's last piece of work at Versailles. This is the first time I've seen it. And it's known as the Salle de Bal.
It was created as a dance theatre, and the cascade merely a backdrop to ballet performances laid on for the court. Le Nôtre was in his 70s when he created his final Baroque extravaganza.
It is fantastically impressive.
Although his work was so dramatic, Le Nôtre himself seems to have been a modest, self-effacing man.
Every account of him has a tone of not just respect, but genuine affability. People liked Le Nôtre. He was, by all accounts, a good and decent man. Just interested in his work, he never sought to aggrandize or glorify himself. And tellingly, he remained the king's friend right up to his death.
He died in 1700, leaving little in the way of plans. But gardens in his style would soon be made right across Europe, thanks to one book that I've come to see in the library at Versailles.
Now, this book is really important because it spread the word of Le Nôtre, and it was called La théorie et la pratique du jardinage. And it includes plans and descriptions on how to make parterre, de bosquet, boulingrin, which of course is a corruption of bowling greens, as well as labyrinths, rooms, galleries, cascades, all the elements of the fashionable garden. And the really important thing is it includes a lot of Le Notre's work and disseminated it. It spread it across Europe. And this French formal garden design was enormously influential. And through this book, someone could buy it and say, oh yeah, I like that. I want that. Here we are, a palisade à l'Italien, and then a palisade from Chantilly, and then a theatre from Versailles. The pictures are there, descriptions, and it was really like a textbook on how to make gardens.
The book was translated into English and German, and soon there were gardens in the new French style from Blenheim Palace to St. Petersburg. But perhaps the most significant of all Le Notre's achievements are the changes he made to the Tuileries Gardens in the heart of Paris. This has been a public garden for hundreds of years. It's a place for Parisians to meet, promenade, and watch the world go by. It was Le Notre who laid it out in its modern form, with its carefully spaced trees and wide pathways.
As so often happens, it was the combination of technology and genius that came together, because the graphometer, which is one of these, was invented about 10 years before Le Notre's birth. So by the time he began to use it in his 20s, it was established. And it's a very simple instrument, but it did enable him to have much grander designs than had hitherto been possible. And it works on the basis you have a fixed baseline, and you take a reading, and you look down through there, and there's a hair lined up on that. And so I can fix that like that, and it's on a post. And then you keep that fixed and move round it, and then adjust this off that baseline, look through, take a reading, and the angle between the two can be written down. So you can put that onto a plan, which means that when you give it to your workmen, they can get it exactly right, even if it's a mile away and it's a great long canal or it's a massive avenue. And of course, that with his vision changed everything.
With his graphometer in hand and an army of labourers, Le Notre was able to cut a central axis running west through the garden and out on beyond its boundaries into what was then open countryside. Originally, this new magnificent vista was named the Avenue des Tuileries. Now, of course, it's called the Champs-Élysées and remains the spine of modern Paris.
Well, the only reasonable response to that view is utter amazement. It is stunning. I actually last saw it 42 years ago, and I couldn't really remember it. And I certainly didn't know then that this, of course, is the line that Le Notre planted. And of course, now we have the Arc de Triomphe, and beyond, from his planting in the 17th century, on cutting through the city into the 21st. In the 1980s, Mitterrand, the president, had this great arch in La Défense Commission. So now Le Notre's line runs through Paris, stretching from the Tuileries to the Arc de Triomphe to that arch, running for over 5 miles.
The arch is the centerpiece of France's financial district, known as La Défense. 10% of the country's wealth is concentrated up in these skyscrapers. From their vantage point, France's financial moguls can see straight back into the heart of historic Paris.
That is an extraordinary view. And I suppose you could see it as a sort of brutal motorway just bulldozing through the center of this lovely city. Or you could see it completely in the spirit of Le Notre, this control of nature that somehow humanizes it at the same time. And in that spirit, down here at La Défense, is a garden.
La Défense was begun in the 1950s as a defiant symbol of France's post-war recovery. And there was only ever one choice of garden style to express the power and wealth the city fathers of Paris hoped would be created here.
The garden was put out to competition, which was won by an American called Dan Kiley. Now, Dan Kiley came to Europe in the Second World War as a serving American soldier, and whilst he was here, he visited the great gardens. And he was enormously influenced by Vaux-le-Vicomte and Versailles. And there's an irony that it took an American to bring back the spirit of Le Nôtre to Paris.
The choice of planting reflects how the world has changed since Le Nôtre's day.
It's easy to think of these beautifully pruned plane trees as quintessentially French and particularly Parisian, but in fact they're very practical. The reason they were planted and continue to be planted is because they resisted pollution. And an awful lot of Le Nôtre's trees died out in the 19th century because of the increased using of coal, which then polluted them. The trees just couldn't cope with this smog that fell on them. Because plane trees lose their bark, so that a year's accumulation of black soot was just shed, and they started over again. So actually, it's a completely practical thing.
I wonder what Le Nôtre would have made of this concrete and glass city. The buildings jostling and competing for space, with none of the symmetry or balance of Versailles or Vaux-le-Vicomte. But his legacy can be found in odd corners.
As you wander around, you'll discover that off the main drag are these side gardens like this one. The cherry today is absolutely at its best. And it's not too fanciful to feel that Kiley has deliberately taken the idea of the bosque and instead of having trees and square woods, has got these square concrete blocks of flats and then little sort of jewel-like gardens inside them.
Dan Kiley took the style of Le Nôtre and expressed it in modern language. But everywhere you look in Paris, you can see the visual vocabulary of Le Nôtre's great gardens, still closely associated with power, wealth, and the state. So outside Les Invalides, France's military museum and Napoleon's tomb, rows of topiary stand like soldiers waiting to go into battle. In public squares like the Place des Vosges, the plane trees are lined up in strict geometric lines. Order, harmony, and symmetry are everywhere, and not just in gardens.
Bonjour.
Je peux vous aider peut-être?
Okay. See, what you have here is the extraordinary elegance of French formality. It's something that the British can't really do, and if we do it, we copy the French. But that symmetry and order, coupled with a refinement, is seen everywhere, and this sort of epitomizes it. Slightly frivolous, but in the best possible way. Choices, choices.
Le choix est dur.
C'est très, très dur. Un tas de citron, s'il vous plaît.
Ce sera tout?
Oui, c'est tout pour le moment.
Sur place ou emporté?
Sur place.
D'accord.
Bon, merci.
This elegant formality is as relevant today as it was in the 16th century. But there is another style of garden that came about as a result of the greatest crisis in French history. At the end of the 18th century, the revolution disposed of royalty and aristocratic power. With this came new fashions, not least in gardens. The formal style of Le Nôtre became associated with the tyranny of the hated aristocracy and was replaced by a new, liberated informality. This is Malmaison, the home of Napoleon and Josephine on the western outskirts of Paris. There was once a large estate surrounding the house. All that remains today is a beautifully restored wildflower meadow and some woods.
It's said that Napoleon and Josephine planted this cedar of Lebanon to commemorate Napoleon's victory at the Battle of Marengo on the 14th of June, 1800. And that was the beginning of the garden here at Malmaison. Now, Josephine was a real gardener, and she was a very serious botanist. But her real passion, which amounted almost to an obsession, were roses.
And Josephine's passion for roses was as influential in its own way as the parterres of Le Nôtre.
Josephine set out to collect every type of rose growing in the world. Now, that was reckoned to be about 250 at that time. And Napoleon apparently instructed his generals to bring back plants wherever they were fighting in the world. So all the forces of the French Empire went behind this quest. Now, we don't know how successful it was, because when she died in 1814, there was no inventory of roses left behind. But what we do have is a fantastic pictorial record of at least some of her roses, because Josephine did commission a Belgian, Pierre-Joseph Redoute, to make engravings of her roses. And they are amongst the loveliest botanical images ever produced. And I've got one here of the rose grown at Malmaison, here looking at it at Malmaison, and that in itself is a thrilling thing. And it is Rosa indica, Rosier de Bengale, and Sans Feuille. Now, Sans Feuille is 100 leaves or centifolia. Now, names have changed since Josephine's time, but this is probably a centifolia rose which would have grown out there in the garden.
There are few roses left at Malmaison, but here at Roseraie de Lay, some 20 miles away, there is a magnificent collection, brought together by a rose enthusiast at the end of the 19th century. Jules Gravreau set out to create a collection to surpass even Josephine's, including the roses illustrated by Redoute.
And here it is, in the flesh, nearly 200 years later, Redoute's rose. It's called Rose de Bengale, from Malmaison, and preserved as such. And to make that link, to know that this was what Josephine collected, this is what Redoute drew. And here it is, it's in my hand, I'm holding it, I can smell it. It is heavenly. It's lovely rose. I've never grown it myself. But that link is such powerful history.
You might think of roses as being part of a typically English garden, but Josephine was the first person in Europe to systematically collect them. And in the 19th century, the French were the world's leading rose breeders, and the names of many of our best-loved roses, such as Cardinal de Richelieu, Madame Alfred Carrière, Souvenir de Malmaison, or Chapeau de Napoleon, are French. I'm on my way to the chateau of Courson, 20 miles south of the Roseraie. It hosts France's biggest flower show, and I want to see if Josephine's floral legacy has the same potency in the 21st century. Among the 200 stalls, a dozen of them are rose growers, like Denis Sauer.
Bonjour. J'ai une question curieuse. Bonjour. Quelle place a la rose dans le cours de jardinier français?
La rose, c'est un des premiers végétales qu'on trouve dans tous les jardins français.
Oui.
C'est ce qu'il y a de plus important. On trouve aussi bien à Marseille, à Lille, à Brest ou à Strasbourg. C'est la première chose que les Français mettent dans leur jardin, c'est la rose.
Et quelle espèce de rose?
D'abord, ce que veut le Français, c'est de la grosse fleur à parfum.
Ouais.
Nous, on est créateurs de rosiers.
Ouais.
Aussi, on sort des nouvelles variétés. Les gens sont attachés à une nouvelle variété, mais sont aussi attachés et apprécient les variétés anciennes.
Bon, merci. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Despite the rain, I'm having a good time. There's an easy informality which has echoes of Malmaison.
This is good. See, they've got rhubarb for sale, direct from the producer, spread out on a leaf on the ground, but it's a plant stall selling rayums. Of course, rhubarb. And it's a cousin of the rayum palmatum that you grow by your pond, which is entirely decorative. And what I particularly like is the way that this stall feels artless. This looks like it's just arrived, unloaded the van, put it out, and there it is. And that does give it a kind of authenticity and real charm that this whole show has. There's something truly charming about it.
The more informal style of gardening was called by the French le jardin à l'anglaise, and certainly most of these plants here at Courson will be at home in an English country garden. But I wonder if this is also true in Paris. This is the Quai de la Mégisserie, where Parisians have been buying their plants and seeds for hundreds of years. I've come here to meet Didier Brou, to find out what the people of Paris are growing today.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Parlez-vous anglais?
Just a little.
Just a little.
Yes.
I understand that you've been working here for 3 generations.
Yes, from here in this shop, from my grandfather. We arrived in 1929 from the Massif Central to sell some plants and beans and seeds for people of Paris.
And do Parisians like flowers? Do they enjoy flowers and buy a lot?
They buy flowers in Paris for French people. They prefer to buy plants like this with flower. And we have 2 sorts of people to buy in our shop. First, it's a gardener for vegetables. So they buy tomatoes, they buy cucurbitacea, salad, all things in plant and seeds. And after you have people who live in apartment in Paris and they want to make a small flower in big box, that's all. And they buy geranium,
You have lots of colour. They are all in flower, aren't they?
Yes.
They're not buying plants that grow, they're buying plants that are good now.
So the modern French gardener does love flowers, but without the bother of growing them. Space in Paris is at a premium. It's got more than twice the population density of London, so gardens are rare. However, I've heard that one of their most upmarket fashion houses has managed to fit one in to an unlikely place. Hermès is a family firm, and the roof garden was created for their private use.
Who would have thought this would be on a roof? It's very smart. White tulips, white pansies. I bet these are white iceberg roses. Looking astonishingly healthy. It's funny to see a hawthorn pruned like that. That's really interesting. A hawthorn, which I think of in my garden as just a scrubby part of a hedge, treated as a decorative shrub, lovingly pruned. It's nice.
This garden strikes me as a modern version of Le Jardin à l'Anglaise. It's understated, controlled elegance.
Of course, what this is international good taste. It's stylish, it's chic, it actually smells a bit of money. So I guess it's very Parisian. It's probably St. Petersburg, New York, Boston, who knows, even Shanghai now. I bet there's a roof garden in Shanghai that looks quite like this. Probably a Hermes roof garden in Shanghai. And there does seem to be a language of the wealthy that is to do with leather and white and box balls. And one part of me feels extremely cynical about it. And the other part of me, rather shamefully, just likes it. Of course, the other thing, which I bet happens here, is that terribly competitive business, fashion business, and everybody's always looking at each other, and they'll be looking over at this roof garden and judging it. Oh, looking a bit shabby, or, oh, it's a bit good. Because actually, if you look over there, there's another roof garden for a company who shall be nameless that clearly could do with a little bit of tending to.
I love Paris. Why, oh, why do I love Paris? Because my love is near.
Given the time, money and manpower involved, I thought it might be impossible to find a modern example of the kind of lavish formality we associate with Le Nôtre's gardens.
However, there is a garden here in Normandy that has been made in the last 20 years that I think Fouquet and the Sun King himself would have been envious of, even if it's only for its scale and its ambition, and to be honest, for its brashness too.
Just 20 years ago, the garden at Champ de Bataille was an empty field. Many million euros later, it's been turned into a garden that Le Nôtre would be proud of. Parterre, central access, fountains, all the hallmarks of the formal 17th century garden are here. The creation of Jacques Garcia. Garcia first fell in love with this place as a child, when he would bicycle past it on his way to school. And decades later, when he had made a fortune as an international interior designer, he then got the chance to buy it. The sheer effort, time and cost of creating a garden like this with all modern-day equipment does make the gardens of 300 years ago all the more impressive.
Niveau ici.
Oui.
Vous avez le fait ou...
C'est fait. Tout, le terrain, c'était comme ça. En fait, tous les niveaux ont été recréés. On a bougé ici pour créer l'espace, 4 millions de mètres cubes de terre. Et 4 millions de mètres cubes, c'est un mur qui irait du nord de l'Angleterre au sud de l'Angleterre, d'1 mètre par 4 mètres.
Amazing.
Voilà, pour créer les espaces qu'on voit ici. Alors voilà le reflet. Ouais. Ouais. Tout ça a été créé, il n'y avait pas le canal.
So nothing there before at all.
Ah ben c'est le plus grand chantier en Europe, je crois, depuis le début du XXe siècle.
Oui.
Ouais, je crois.
C'est un projet si grand.
Oui, ça c'est sûr.
Oui. Et peut-être il coûtera des millions.
Alors, c'est un sujet très intéressant parce que, déjà pour démarrer, je n'avais pas la conscience de la masse d'argent qu'il fallait. Et si j'avais su, c'est toujours la même histoire, je n'y serais jamais allé. Non. Jamais. C'est quelque chose qui apporte une douleur qu'on ne peut même pas raconter. Car quand vous démarrez ça, tout le monde est contre vous. Après, évidemment, aujourd'hui, vous me dites que c'est très beau. Très bien. Vous seriez venu en 94, vous rentriez en Angleterre en disant « ce type est un dingue, il faut l'arrêter ».
But it has evidently been worth it. And Jacques is adamant that it is more than just a pastiche of Le Nôtre.
Rien n'est une reconstitution pure et dure ici. Tous ces ifs que vous voyez là, jamais ça a été fait au XVIIe siècle. Mais si quelqu'un y avait pensé au XVIIe siècle, il s'inscrivait dans l'idée du XVIIe siècle. Ce qui compte, c'est de ressortir l'âme de la chose et pas nécessairement une justesse d'un moment précis qui d'ailleurs n'avait qu'un caractère très éphémère.
A garden like this
is so outside normal domestic experience that it's hard to take in. And, you know, you can see what happened to Nicolas Fouquet when he tried. He came to a bad end. And Louis XIV could rule the world. And so the garden became an expression of that. And for Monsieur Garcia, it is an incredible thing to attempt to do. And he did say if he had known, he never would have tried it. And the millions it's cost him and the years it's taken. But how fabulous that it's done. The Baroque garden was a place that was shiny, it was gold-plated, it was splashy and noisy and absolutely about money. So if you come here, which you should do because it's lovely, what you're getting is what the 17th century garden actually would have been like. When you walk here, you're walking in exactly the same spirit of a garden that Versailles was, or Vaux-le-Vicomte. It's got under the skin of the 17th century in a way that no historical recreation, however accurate, ever could do.
Perhaps Garcia's creation confirms that in the end, France's greatest contribution to landscape gardens is in the formality and scale set by Le Nôtre. This style of gardening, with its balance, order and love of structure, is still at the heart of French life. In the modernist alleys of La Défense, the rows of plane trees in the public gardens of Paris, and even in the layout of Paris itself. Added to this, Josephine's love of roses and informality can still be found. I've kept my favourite garden, the Chateau of Courance, to last, because it has the best qualities of both styles.
I want to show you now a garden that's about 35 miles south of Paris. And I love it because it seems to me the perfect combination of the rigour and formality of the 17th century formal garden, and also the charm that comes when a garden is allowed to mature and slowly age across the centuries.
Versailles and Vaux-le-Vicomte have been preserved as they were in the 17th century. But Courance shows what happens when you allow this formal style to change and evolve. First created during the Renaissance, the gardens were remodeled in the style of Le Nôtre, but fell into disuse. When the de Gannet family bought the abandoned chateau in the 1870s, they restored the gardens and have continued to adapt them since. From its beginning, the layout of Courance has been hugely influenced by its ready supply of that one key ingredient of the French formal garden: water.
In the 17th century, the single most impressive thing to have in a garden was water. And people went to extraordinary lengths, both financially and with ingenuity, not to say skill, to provide it, to control it, shape it, divert it, and to impress people. Now, Courance has masses of water. And that's because it's a wet place. There are springs popping up all over the place. And the net result is that there is a kind of effortless ease with which it's carried.
Perhaps the garden's greatest involuntary transformation came in the last war, when the chateau was requisitioned by first the Germans and then the Allies, and much of the garden was buried under concrete. I'm having tea with Philippine de Gannet, who's lived here for over 60 years.
Field Marshal Montgomery was here, very strict. He was only nice with, only charming with the children, my daughters who were tiny, 7, 8, and 10. And with us, he was very nice, but not very amusing.
So what was the garden like just after the war?
It was a shamble. Because as you know, a garden, if you haven't taken care of it for 4 years, and my husband, when he came back from Indochina, he said, I'm going to try and save it. And then he changed the park a lot, because all the paths used to be in gravel, you know, there were people scratch all day, or in yellow sand. And now there's none left, apart this one across. All the rest you've been walking on is grass. Yes. I must say, I think it's very beautiful, and for a very formous, pompous garden, generally they're formal and pompous, but they don't have much charm. And I find this has charm, and people say to me, oh, c'est charmant. Well, it's funny to say that about something like this, but you see, so I hope they'll continue liking it as we did.
By replacing the hard lines and gravel paths of the historic garden with lawn, Philippine and her husband have made Correns into a garden which is both formal and romantic.
It's interesting how, at this time of year in particular, mid-spring, the emerging leaves don't cast shade as such. They just change the texture of the green. So you have all these different green lights, from the very pale to the really quite rich and dark, but not somber. And that's lovely. And also, because you know that it's temporary, it feels precious. So the whole thing glows.
One of the things I love about Correns is the way it takes the classic forms of the French formal garden and lets them grow wild to transform them.
The bosquet at Versailles are tightly enclosed little woods with the trees peeking out of the top of tall hedges. But here, the woods have exploded out. They're mature. They've got hundreds of years' worth of growth. And the hedges are garden-sized. And so the relationship has completely changed between the inside and the outside. And if anything, I think this looks better. The key to this garden is that it is as historical in terms of provenance and story as any in France, really, but that it has evolved. It's evolved in the way that people use it, and also in the way that plants have been allowed to grow. They've changed and adapted. But the spirit of the garden, and that means the framework too, has remained. And it's that balance that has been nurtured and maintained between the past and the living present that makes it so successful.
Next time, I get my hands dirty and explore a very different side to French life.
On coupe, et on lève. That's it. On rebouche. Asperge blanche.
Their passion for food and their fantastic kitchen gardens, from the monastic tradition through the great historical potager to the gardens of Michelin-starred restaurants.